All right, guys, good evening. Tonight we are going to be talking about our next lesson within the civil rights movement, and that is going to be titled Conflict Within the Movement. So our learning target for today, I can explain how the civil rights movement became divided. So we're basically going to look at some problems that the civil rights movement faced, and as a result of that is how we're going to have a branching off from the main movement, which was that civil disobedience movement led primarily by MLK. So, the fundamental problem with racism is you have two different types of kind of racism. You have de jure, which is by law, and you have de facto, which is by custom. And so, the NAACP, they went after de jure segregation because their goal was to win court cases in the Supreme Court. And if they could win cases within the Supreme Court, then they could eliminate de jure segregation and make it illegal. But here's the problem with racism. The problem with racism is that racism is not just because the law exists. Racism is a feeling. And it's a lack of acceptance. And just because you have schools being desegregated, you have all public facilities being desegregated, that does not mean that we're all of a sudden going to have a lack of acceptance. People still have to change their feelings. And if people do not change their feelings, then racism will still exist. And that is the fundamental problem here. And what we're going to see is the African American community, they're going to get fed up with being treated as second-class citizens. Maybe not by the law, but by people. And we're going to see a lot of issues arise because African Americans are fed up being second-class. What are we going to look at? We're going to look at urban violence, and urban violence is going to take place in the inner city, and it is primarily going to be between black residents who are primarily living in the inner city, black residents versus white police. And we're going to see a lot of examples of police brutality take place in the urban areas, and blacks who have put up with it for tens and hundreds of years, they're finally going to start to fight back. And when these African Americans start to fight back, you are going to see violence start to erupt. You are going to see riots that are going to take place within the inner city. Riots that will go on for 5-6 days. Riots where hundreds and even thousands of people are hurt and killed because African Americans are fed up. And there are many whites out there who don't get it. And here's what they don't get. They don't get why are African Americans upset? Because the way that they look at it is that within the last 10-15 years, African Americans have gained more rights by desegregation laws than they ever had before. So white people aren't understanding this. They're saying that blacks are coming further along than they ever had before at such an incredible pace. Why is this violence occurring? Because their thought process is this is not what MLK is preaching. And MLK is kind of the face of the civil rights movement, especially for white people. So why is this happening? Now, a lot of this is taking place because African Americans, again, they're being sick and tired of treated as second-class citizens. Maybe not by the law, but how they live, the condition of the schools that they go to, the housing that they live in, not being able to have job opportunities because of discrimination in public workplaces. And remember, this is all stuff that was supposed to be cured by the Great Society. So economic opportunities are supposed to improve because of the Great Society. But The Great Society, as we talked about during the Vietnam War, if you don't remember this, go back and check your notes. The Great Society was destroyed by Vietnam. So even though LBJ tried very hard to help African Americans, and he did do a lot, the problem is that the Great Society, which was supposed to help out African Americans economically especially, was killed by the Vietnam War. And so what we're going to see is we're going to see new leaders start to emerge. And the most famous leader that emerges in the civil rights movement that kind of disagrees with MLK is a guy by the name of Malcolm X. Okay, so Malcolm X was a black Muslim who was a fantastic speaker. He was a person that if you heard him talk, you couldn't kind of turn away from him. He was very, very persuasive. And being a black Muslim from a group known as the Nation of Islam, his beliefs were different. Malcolm X took a pretty violent approach because he was sick and tired of all of the violence that was taking place in the inner city by this white police. He was sick of the discrimination. He was sick of everything. So he basically preached that forget about trying to make good with the white person. What we want to try to do is be great despite white people. He felt that we cannot get along, whites and blacks, and as a result, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do our own thing. Okay, so forget about trying to make good with white people. Now, in the process of this, what actually happens is Malcolm X, unfortunately, is assassinated. And he is assassinated because he breaks away from this Nation of Islam, and this Nation of Islam is a pretty radical group. So Malcolm X actually comes back, and he starts to kind of go along with the teachings of Martin Luther King. But he only gets to do that for less than a year. And once that happens, once he's assassinated, again, we're going to see his teachings kind of take off because he's remembered as being a person who promotes violence for African Americans as a way of gaining equality. Next person that emerges is a guy by the name of Stokely Carmichael. Now remember, Carmichael was the leader of SNCC. And what does SNCC stand for? Student, I'm just going to abbreviate that. Nonviolent, this is the big one. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was a group that marched alongside Martin Luther King for a long time. But what's going to happen is you're going to see Stokely Carmichael basically get beaten almost to death. And he's going to come up with a new message. And this new message is going to be something known as Black Power. And in this message known as Black Power, it's basically, again, the same idea of Martin Luther King. Forget about white people. We have to go out there. We have to do what's best for African Americans. The time is now. We're sick and tired of waiting for equality. It's not going to happen. Black Power. And this new method that he's going to take is very similar to Malcolm X. And it's if we have to use violence, let's use violence. And so this message is going to be pretty harmful for African Americans because you're seeing this divide that starts to emerge. You have people who are backing Martin Luther King, more prominent middle class African Americans, and also white people because they see that he is doing what needs to be done. But then you also see the lower class African Americans in the inner city who start to emerge and start to agree with people like Stokely Carmichael, people like Malcolm X, people like the next group that we're going to talk about known as the Black Panthers. Now, the Black Panthers are a super radical group of African Americans. The Black Panthers are going to emerge after a huge riot ensues in Oakland, okay? So they emerge in Oakland in the year 1966. And basically the message of the Black Panthers is that they want to fight. They want to fight everyone. A lot of people who started the Black Panthers, they were victims, of police brutality, white police brutality. And so their thought process is that we are going to fight, fight, fight. And so their slogan, one of their main slogans, is power flows from the barrel of a gun. And again, this kind of goes along with our theme of these new radical groups that are going to emerge in the African American community, and they are going to be pro-violence, for violence in order to get things done. And who were their followers? Well, they had a lot of followers. They were actually pretty successful. They're also in Forrest Gump when Jenny got slapped around by that white dude, and Forrest went and almost beat that dude to death. That was in a Black Panther meeting, actually. Sorry, sidetracked. Their followers, they had a lot of people from SNCC, which again is ironic because of what that N stands for. They had a lot of young followers. Remember, because the younger you are, kind of the more radical you tend to be. And they also had a lot of people from urban areas. Now, all of these things are huge, all these things are crucial, but what most people still see is the civil disobedient movement from Dr. King. That April of 1968, when MLK is assassinated. And as you can imagine, riots break out all throughout the country. Martin Luther King is the savior of the African American community, and he is assassinated by a white racist. It is going to be a huge, huge blow to the civil rights movement. And how are people going to react? They're going to freak out. And a lot of people in America, white and black, were very worried about what this country was going to turn into because they felt that the divide was going to be worse than ever. We have one person, though, that tries to follow through with the teachings of Martin Luther King, that has a national voice, and that person is Robert Kennedy. Now remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, arguably the most important piece of legislation for African Americans in the 20th century, was started by his big brother JFK. And so RFK was a huge, huge believer in civil rights. And remember, Kennedy, right around this time period, is gaining traction. He's in the process of winning the Democratic nomination for the President of the United States, and there's a good chance that he is going to become the President of the United States in 1968. So I kind of refer to Kennedy as the great white hope for African Americans, because he will change things. Unfortunately, though, June of 1968, and again, we talked about it, RFK is assassinated. So he's shot and killed. And again, another huge blow to African Americans during this time period. So that's all for today. We're going to talk more about these conflicts that emerge. But if we can explain how the civil rights movement became divided, basically the idea of de jure versus de facto, and the fact that de facto segregation still exists because the attitudes of people have not changed, that will lead African Americans to want more, faster, and the way that they're going to try to do this now is they're going to try to use violence to get ahead. So if we can figure that out, if we understand that, then we're good to go. That's all I got for you guys tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night, and I will see you all on Tuesday.